The assembly lines are silent. The shipments are frozen at the border. Billions of dollars in inventory have vanished overnight. This is not a theoretical trade war. This is an economic catastrophe unfolding in real time. A sovereign act has triggered the unthinkable, the nationalization of American-made factory output on foreign soil, halting the engine of North American manufacturing and sending shockwaves deep into the foundation of U.S. industrial stability. If you are a manufacturer, investor, or simply a citizen dependent on the stability of this continent's intertwined economies, you need to understand the gravity of this moment. Subscribe now to our continuous coverage as we track the immediate and long-term consequences of this unprecedented industrial freeze, a crisis that threatens the very framework of the North American supply chain and the livelihoods tied to it. The immediate mechanism of the crisis, the strategic seizure of critical output from key manufacturing hubs across Mexico's industrial heartland, was executed with surgical precision, targeting sectors integral to U.S. just-in-time production, particularly automotive, aerospace, and high-tech components. This was not a slow-moving trade dispute. It was an abrupt, decisive governmental action, justified by internal decrees invoking national economic sovereignty and regulatory non-compliance, effectively turning finished goods and works in progress into state-controlled assets. The paralyzing effect was instantaneous, acting like an economic embolism that immediately cut off the flow of essential parts destined for U.S. final assembly plants in Texas, Michigan, and throughout the Midwest, a region now staring down an existential base built on decades of nestifaction based on U.S. MSCA and USMCA, and USMCA and USMSCA, and USMCA and US and US and USMCA and US, and USMCA and USAS, and West sense gay and sen, Guinness so. In a can with can you sends in with can second go in an men sense and can and send for and this can and ben and so and Benson I can up again I guess it as I with well I got book gap with so I guess I go yes because then this because the sub memoirs about so this sudden halt to the cross-border flow has exposed the perilous fragility inherent in tightly optimized, low-inventory supply chains, particularly those that relied on Mexico's strategic advantages in labor and logistics. Factories across the U.S., designed for a continuous feed of components like wire harnesses, microprocessors, and specific automotive castings, found their operations grinding to a complete stop within 72 hours of the seizure announcement, moving from full production to mandatory furlough and complete shutdown with devastating speed. The reliance on this single, geographically concentrated source for critical output, a strategy long lauded for its efficiency, has proven to be an Achilles heel, demonstrating that efficiency without redundancy is a liability when faced with a catastrophic geopolitical event of this magnitude. The financial dominoes began to fall even before the week was out, with the most heavily leveraged U.S. Tier 1 and Tier 2 suppliers companies that operate on razor-thin margins and massive debt becoming the first casualties of the sudden revenue dry-up, unable to service their debt, facing contract breach penalties, and holding zero-value inventory stuck across the border. These mid-sized industrial players quickly moved toward Chapter 11 and, in many cases, outright liquidation, filing for bankruptcy protection in a cluster never before seen outside of a major financial crash. This wave of industrial insolvency is not merely an inconvenience. It represents a systemic failure, eroding the capital and skilled labor base of the U.S. manufacturing ecosystem and threatening the long-term viability of entire industrial corridors. The political justification for these seizures, while domestically popular in certain sectors of Mexican politics focused on resource nationalism and energy independence, has been framed by U.S. officials as a profound and direct violation of the foundational investment and property protection clauses within the USMCA. The dispute centers on a fundamental disagreement over regulatory authority, with the Mexican government asserting the right to control strategic industrial output, allegedly due to environmental or labor infractions which the seized U.S. entities vehemently deny, claiming the moves are thinly veiled acts of nationalization disguised as enforcement. This legal and diplomatic quagmire now pits the world's two largest neighbors against each other in a battle that will define the enforceability and very future of the North American trade agreement, raising the stakes far beyond the immediate economic loss. The deep-seated historical context of this action cannot be ignored, echoing the significant nationalizations of the past, particularly in the energy sector, which have always marked flashpoints in U.S.-Mexico relations. This latest move, however, is distinct in its target, the manufacturing output that sustains U.S. consumer and industrial markets. Rather than solely raw natural resources, the precedent being set is one of direct governmental intervention in the productive capacity of foreign-owned assets, a move that fundamentally redefines the risk profile of foreign direct investment throughout the global south and forces multinational corporations to instantly reassess the stability of their global manufacturing footprints. potentially triggering a costly and chaotic reshoring or rediversification effort that will span the next decade. The fallout is already extending far beyond the balance sheets of the immediate victims, creating a humanitarian and social crisis as mass layoffs ripple through the affected regions of both countries. In the U.S., the sudden closure of assembly plants is devastating blue-collar communities that were just beginning to recover from prior economic disruptions, leading to soaring unemployment and a desperate search for political accountability. Meanwhile, in Mexico, the thousands of local workers who staffed the seized factories are caught in the crossfire, their livelihoods abruptly suspended as the factories sit dormant, waiting for a diplomatic resolution that may take years, transforming bustling industrial parks into monuments of geopolitical standoff. The psychological impact on investor confidence in North America is perhaps the most damaging long-term consequence, shattering the once unshakable belief in the region's integrated economic stability. The fundamental assumption that investment capital, property rights, and commercial contracts are secure under the USMCA has been gravely undermined, leading to an immediate flight of capital and a massive reassessment of future cross-border projects. Companies considering nearshoring from Asia, a trend that was gaining significant momentum, are now paralyzed by the realization that proximity does not equate to security, injecting a new element of geopolitical risk premium into every capital expenditure decision made across the continent. To truly understand the political and economic forces driving this crisis, including the legal challenges being prepared under USMCA Chapter 31 and the emergency diplomatic negotiations taking place behind closed doors, we urge you to share this in-depth analysis with your colleagues and networks. This story is a defining moment for the future of global supply chain management and international law. The seizure of finished goods, an act of industrial warfare by any other name, has illuminated a chilling truth that in the pursuit of nationalistic economic control, long-standing trade agreements and the complex architecture of global supply chains can be unraveled with a single decree. The resulting bankruptcies are not isolated incidents of corporate failure. They are the symptom of a fractured industrial reality, forcing every single executive to ask, if the rule of law protecting property and output can be so swiftly overridden in a trusted neighbor like Mexico, where in the world can reliable production truly be secured? This catastrophic event demands a fundamental reassessment of every single multinational's operational model, pushing the global economy into a new, far more precarious era of guarded, fragmented production. The question is no longer if the North American economy will recover, but what fundamentally different form it will take after this defining shock. The assembly lines have gone silent. The financial markets are paralyzed in stunned disbelief. Contracts, once sacrosanct, are now mere paper fragments, worthless in a court of national decree. The dominoes are not just falling across the industrial heartland, they are shattering a continent's 70-year economic integration. This is the systemic shock that follows the unprecedented action by the Mexican government, the immediate and systematic seizure of finished and in-process output from hundreds of foreign-owned manufacturing facilities, an act that instantaneously severed the vital circulatory system of North American commerce, triggering the inevitable cascade of industrial bankruptcies we are now documenting in real time. To fully comprehend the scale of this industrial cataclysm and its ongoing fallout, and to track the subsequent market and legal maneuvers, ensure you subscribe to our deep dive analysis. The story is evolving faster than the markets can react, requiring continuous, granular coverage. The systemic collapse was preordained by the inherent fragility of the just-in-time or JIT inventory model, which has been the cornerstone of automotive, aerospace, and electronics manufacturing across the North American region for decades. When the final output, the crucial components, the near-complete vehicles, the integrated circuits was blocked, cash flow did not merely slow, it ceased entirely, creating an immediate, non-recoverable gap between production costs and realization of revenue. This instantaneous financial shockwave immediately propagated up the supply chain, initiating default clauses across the entire ecosystem, from the smallest Tier 3 component suppliers in the U.S. Midwest to the multinational corporations who relied on the Mexican-based final assembly stage, confirming the deep dependency of the U.S. economy on Mexico's participation in global value chains. The initial reports are of liquidations surpassing the total capital reserves set aside for major natural disasters, illustrating that political risk, when weaponized, far exceeds meteorological unpredictability. This catastrophic event, though singular in its scale, is not without historical precedent or warning signs. Drawing on Mexico's long-standing tradition of state interventionism, notably exemplified by the nationalization of the energy sector in 1938, a historical touchstone that continues to shape current policy and investor anxieties. This recent massive seizure action is seen by legal experts as an extreme escalation of the regulatory and asset disputes that had already been bubbling, such as the high-profile and unilateral seizure of the Vulcan Materials deepwater port, an action that previously drew sharp condemnations and warnings from U.S. senators about the erosion of investment security. This history highlights that the underlying risk was always present. Optimized efficiency simply obscured the geopolitical vulnerability. The seizure was a political and economic calculated risk, a desperate play that treated international contracts not as legal instruments, but as mere political bargaining chips. The immediate projection for the future is a protracted, multi-jurisdictional legal conflict set to paralyze international trade relations for the better part of a decade. The U.S. and Canada, as signatories to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, are now forced to navigate the Dispute Settlement Mechanisms Chapter 31, under conditions of profound economic duress, an unprecedented test for the Continental Trade Pact. However, the current structure of the agreement, particularly its complex provisions for investor-state dispute settlement (ISDS), has already generated significant opposition and criticism from industry lawyers for its limitations, a flaw that will now be mercilessly exploited by the defendant state. The sheer volume of concurrent claims for expropriation, estimated to rapidly surpass a cumulative total of $1 trillion, risks overwhelming international arbitration forums, turning the crisis from a simple trade dispute into a prolonged systemic failure, of an internation disputer of the medicinal systemic failure. A systemicipulio, systeminant, systeminic systemation, systeminispulis, and kinesinis, senisikinis, sense and senates and sense and sense and sense and sense and porix and send and man to man and with and pen and a man Francis and his sense of services were so sad. A sound for sup so Geopolitically, the action has triggered a rapid and irreversible decoupling, shattering the long-held strategic goal of nearshoring, moving supply chains closer to the U.S. market hand, forcing a sudden, costly, and chaotic reshoring effort. The U.S. government is now facing immense pressure to nationalize or heavily subsidize the reconstruction of domestic industrial capacity in critical sectors like automotive parts, pharmaceutical precursors, and heavy electronics, a move that will require massive federal spending, immediately driving up national debt and inflation. Furthermore, Mexico is facing immediate and harsh sanctions, financial isolation, and a near-total cessation of foreign direct investment from North America and Europe, effectively crippling its long-term economic growth prospects and deepening its dependence on internal and non-Western capital sources. This geopolitical rupture, the direct result of weaponized state intervention, also forces a profound reckoning on the concept of friendshoring itself. The sudden realization that even the most deeply integrated economic partner, one whose economy is fundamentally dependent on the U.S. with a significant portion of its economy integrated with U.S. global value chains, could execute such a radical, self-destructive maneuver, exposes the fallacy of relying solely on geographical proximity for supply chain security. The new strategic imperative for global corporations is no longer efficiency or proximity, but radical redundancy in multi-regional diversification, demanding investments in completely separate manufacturing hubs across Asia, Europe, and the remaining reliable parts of the Americas. This shift ensures that no single political action, however extreme, can again cripple an entire continental economy. The most profound, yet often underreported, consequence lies in the social and human cost, extending far beyond the balance sheets of multinational corporations. Hundreds of thousands of workers across Mexico were immediately rendered unemployed by the factory seizures, thrusting vulnerable communities that had thrived under foreign investment back into extreme poverty, which is fertile ground for increased social unrest and political instability. Simultaneously, the U.S. has seen an immediate, significant surge in layoffs in manufacturing, logistics, and retail sectors directly tied to the supply chain collapse. This unemployment crisis, now politicalized, forces the U.S. administration to choose between politically popular but economically unsustainable industrial subsidies or managing a multi-year contraction of its domestic manufacturing base. The destruction of specialized industrial clusters, centers of highly skilled, irreplaceable labor, represents a loss of industrial capacity that will take a generation, not just a fiscal quarter, to rebuild. The ongoing market volatility, therefore, is not a temporary correction. It is the price of rebuilding trust from absolute zero and re-engineering decades of optimized interdependence that has suddenly proven to be a fatal vulnerability. The entire global economic architecture, optimized for speed and cost over resilience, is now exposed as dangerously fragile. The most difficult reality to accept is the destruction of trust, the essential, unwritten contract between sovereign nations and international investors that underpin the entire framework of North American free trade. This trust, once shattered by such a flagrant act of economic self-immolation and hostility, is not easily restored. We are tracking the crucial numbers and the regulatory pivots daily. The economic data we are tracking, updated from proprietary sources, is the only reliable way to navigate this unprecedented systemic risk and understand the unfolding political response. Keep our stream open for the crucial numbers and analysis. The path forward demands painful concessions and a complete restructuring of trade relations, likely involving the creation of new punitive trade safeguards and revised investment treaties that explicitly address the risk of state-sponsored output seizure. For Mexico, the long-term projection is one of enforced isolation until massive concessions are made, with foreign investment only returning to sectors deemed strategically essential and then only under extensive, internationally backed guarantees. For the U.S., the crisis mandates a deep strategic review of its economic partnership models, recognizing that geopolitical alignment is now a more critical factor than geographical proximity or labor cost. The question is whether the lessons learned from this disaster, the hard-won knowledge of the true cost of unchecked political risk, will lead to genuine, diversified resilience, or simply a renewed search for short-term cost-cutting efficiencies once the immediate crisis has faded from the headlines. This event forces a reckoning on the true cost of industrial efficiency versus geopolitical risk. The question remains, can the world afford to be this interconnected, or will this moment be remembered as the definitive breaking point for 50 years of globalized manufacturing?